Good morning and welcome back to the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. And this is Monday morning, just come out of the sea. Fingertips and toes are a bit numb, hugging a mug of coffee while I make the final edits to our next episode. And this is episode 017 with Jessica J. Lee. And this is a good one. I know I say that every time, but I mean it. Jessica used to live in Berlin, and that's where she got into wild swimming in the lakes in Berlin and around Germany. And that's how I was introduced to Jessica, through Jessica writing, nature writing about her swims in the nature writing book Turning, which we talk about in this episode. And we also talk about second nature writing book, Two Trees Make a Forest. And Jessica has just been named as the 2020 Hillary Western Writers Trust Prize for nonfiction, and was also 2019 RBC Taylor Prize Emerging Writer Award winner. Sitting down with Jessica was an honour, because I've always admired her writing, but then to actually talk to her and get behind the words and to find out her motivations or her thinking was really good. It was so good. And again, this was recorded mid-August. So we're in lockdown, and we're still in lockdown now, and this is nearly the end of November. Well, we talk about language, place, identity, islands, and also about that issue which is happening now of the scarcity of exposure for Black nature writing. And it's a case of it's just not getting out there. It's there. We are writing, but it's just not getting that centering, that elevation, that amplification that other nature writing does get. And this was the motivation behind Jessica starting the Willow Hope Review, which is an online space for Black nature writing from people of the global majority. Yes. And I'm so pleased that this space exists, because it just makes it easier to find my tribe. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to another person who's part of my tribe, Jessica J. Lee. Please sit back or even walk. I hear that some of you walk and listen to this podcast, which I think is awesome. So yeah, enjoy, and see you back here for the next episode. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. This podcast is for and about women of colour and our relationship with nature. Hosted by me, Cherie Mack. The Earth, Sea, Love podcast is committed to exploring the experiences of women of colour with Mother Nature. We want to provide spaces where the hidden voices in the environmental and conservation conversations can explore their relationship with the natural world. Inspired by our time spent outdoors, we amplify the voices of women of colour, our stories, our conversations, interviews, photography, writing, and artwork. We'll be exploring our legacies histories and memories which have had an influence and effect upon how we perceive ourselves within the natural world and within the environmental and climate justice movements. Welcome to the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. The Earth, Sea, Love podcast has been made possible by the funding from National Lottery Heritage Fund. Thank you. Well, it's lovely to see you. How you've been during these strange and turbulent times, and where you're situated. Like, can you see nature where you are now?
Let's see. During the past little while, I feel like it's been okay. Because I already work from home, it's not been a huge change for me, if I'm honest. But it does mean my husband's also working from home. And I think the biggest change actually is just for my dog, who has us around all the time. So I think in a way it wasn't a huge transition, but at first it took a little while for me to get over the boredom of not really doing anything else. But if I'm honest, the longer I spent at home, the more I realized I'm actually quite a homebody and quite reclusive, and so it worked well for me. And I'm surprised that, I'm surprised to say that I do feel somewhat connected to the natural world living where we are, because we live in central Berlin, and I feel like I hadn't really spent a lot of time getting to know my neighborhood when it comes to plants and the trees and just really noticing those details. I was always going out into the countryside or going to lakes or going to forests. And, once we were really just here at home, I don't know, I really looked out my window and I actually noticed that there were multiple great trees outside my window. And I planted a little communal garden with my neighbors in our shared courtyard. And so I've been, tending to the vegetable garden every day. And that has really been a bit of a solace for me. And even just to get my hands in the soil,
Yeah, totally. It resonates with me, the idea of maybe going out further to connect with nature rather than what's on our doorsteps. And I know, because where I live on the coast. So I have been always been connected with the seas because I like to wild swim. But I think during this time, I even made that a bit smaller and didn't quite connect as much with the sea, but maybe just at the park that was just around the corner. So yeah, and I think a lot of people can say they've had that reignited reconnection, reappreciation of nature around them.
Yeah. And closeness with the local patch, right? Like for me, it feels much more intimate in this way. It's like that staying close to home and really getting to know the bits that are just outside the door. I'd always sort of noticed them, but I never really looked, I never really paid attention. And so feeling a closeness with that is, I think, the key takeaway I've had of the past few months.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. And I suppose it's also thrown up to me the idea of privilege that I have got these green spaces close by to enjoy, while there's many like us that haven't had that green space too, and are feeling the absence of it as well. So I am grateful for a lot of things.
It's really underscored that. I think for me, realizing how nice a bit I live in, actually, it's been really a good reminder.
Yeah, and sometimes we need that, don't we? This whole pandemic has been a big, huge reminder of not taking things for granted, in a sense, I say. Right, so I first came to you, Jessica, through turning lessons from swimming in Berlin Lakes. That's how I found you, because I was really diving into my own relationship with water, and I was reading these memoirs stroke nature writing texts, I would say, around water and trying to find that language, I would say, to marry my identity with the natural world. And I found yours really inspiring. Is it all right if you talk about a bit about this book? Because first of all, I'd
Yeah.
like to know, how did you get into swimming these lakes in Berlin? Or should I ask you how you got to Berlin, maybe?
I mean, it's all sort of tied together. It's really sort of one story. I originally came to Berlin during my doctorate. I was doing a research placement here at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. I had like a one-term fellowship here, and so I was sent here, and it was this thing that I hadn't really planned. I wasn't intending to move to Germany. I thought I would be going back to the UK to finish my fieldwork for my PhD, which was about Hampstead Heath, and part of which involved field work with winter swimmers at the Kenwood Ladies Pond.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was ready in that headspace to go back to Britain to finish my field work and to really sort of, dig into that. And I ended up coming to Berlin for this research stay. And because I knew I was going to be doing this field work with the winter swimmers, I had been instructed that I should really just keep swimming as often as I could so that by the time winter came, I would be, really set for it. So I did. And I realized when I got here that this was a city that basically is surrounded by lakes. There are over 3,000 in the region. And it's just one of those things I didn't really know about before I moved here. I feel like my associations were with Berlin were much more historical or much more with sort of millennial cool in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
thought, okay, this will be like a fun place to be for a few months. And instead, I got here and I ended up spending all of my time sort of cycling out into the countryside, jumping into really cold lakes, and developing like a real intimacy with the landscape here. And that surprised me. And completely threw my big plan sort of off kilter. And I ended up staying here, and I've been here now for 6 years. And yeah, I ended up swimming quite a lot in that time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting that you're saying about jumping into the cold, and there's something about that. I mean, I jump into the sea, and it's always cold. It's the North Sea, and there's a fear. There is a fear every time I go to the water. There's a fear, and there's a fear of like, what's it going to be like? But then also there's that fear of like, where's the bottom or not? And this is something that you've experienced, no?
Yeah, I mean, I was really terrified of particularly lake swimming, but of swimming in, I would say, any natural body of water for most of my life until I was about maybe 19. And then I started sort of slowly getting into the idea of lake swimming. But I will say the fear of that has never left. And, people always say to me, how did you overcome your fear
Yeah,
of swimming, like of wild swimming? And I would say, well, you don't. Like, I've never overcome the fear. I just swim with it.
yeah.
And that is sort of important to me to be like, okay, I can be scared of something and acknowledge that and say, I'm gonna do it anyway. I want to get out and feel the water on my skin. I want that sensation. And for me, that's why it is, it seems cliche to say it's a bit like meditation, but there is that, I think, sustained focus. If you're trying to not think about how scary something is while you're doing it,
Yes.
for me, it's like look at the horizon, feel the sensation, look at the sky. Don't think about the depth. Don't
Yeah.
think about the bit that really scares me, and that is, I think, a really good mental exercise for me to be able to focus on something as I'm moving through fear, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and that's such a really good way of describing it actually, of as a meditation. And if you're thinking about how as we're meditating, it is being aware of those thoughts, but just letting them pass and remaining in that present moment of whatever you're feeling and whatever those sensations are. And that fear helps, but also the cold does help to bring you back into your body. And
Sure does.
yeah, 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 yeah. But you mentioned your studies, and you're an environmental historian, yeah. And there's
Yeah.
this lovely word. Is it limnology or limnology? And
Limnology,
yeah,
yeah.
can you explain that, please? Because I think I came into an understanding of it through mountain lakes in Snowdonia, which again are bottomless, they say. So yeah, so please explain that because I think it's gorgeous.
Yeah, limnology. So limnology is just, I mean, it's a really broad term, which is perhaps not even all that useful from a scientific standpoint, but it basically just refers to the study of lakes, the study of freshwaters. Um, and I got really into reading old limnological texts and speaking to limnologists and freshwater ecologists while I was writing Turning, partly because I wanted something to counterbalance my own very aesthetic, very personal, very emotional relationship to lakes and to swimming. So it was a field that I didn't really know anything about before I got into it. Um, and it encompasses everything from sort of the biology and chemistry of freshwater lakes, like through to um, the geology of them, how they are, how they were formed. So it's a really broad field. It covers physics and chemistry and biology. And I mean, these days you would most likely speak of being a freshwater ecologist, but limnology is a kind of, I think it's a lovely old word and an old umbrella category that I quite enjoy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was quite a fascinating thing to, for want of a better word, dive into.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
on it.
Yeah, because, like, as I say, it was a case of, like, the idea of what the water rolls over will affect clarity of that water, the blueness or the greenness of the water.
Yeah, getting to know the cycles of lakes, that was like a big part of, I think, my thinking around the book. Because it is something that it's like when you are a regular swimmer, if you're swimming in a body of water, a few times a week, the entire year, you notice every single change.
Yeah.
And it was really important for me to understand, perhaps from a scientific standpoint, you could say, what actually was happening there. And to be able to actually say this is something that you can really sense. You don't need to be a limnologist to notice it. You can be a swimmer and you will notice it.
Yeah.
And that was really, I don't know, it was quite profound for me to say, okay, this is a way of connecting with place that is a bit different than the way I would normally do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that I could hold all of those together.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And also, if you're thinking about place, and we've also talked about limnology and the language, there's a quote that you say, home is as much in a language as it is in a landscape. And I found that really interesting because that's something that you have in Turning, but then it's also come back up again in your recent book. Two trees make a forest. I've been reading it. And it's in there as like home is a language, that idea. And I suppose I want to like go back a bit further. Okay, you're in Berlin, but you've had your home in many different places. Also, your ancestors have. Do you want to touch upon that if you can,
Yeah.
please?
I mean, I think so. I became really preoccupied with the idea of language when I moved to Germany. And I think that was because I've always been multilingual since I was a child. As I was learning German, I realized German became the sort of my non-English languages, it became the strongest one for me, which was quite, I think, shocking, and it sort of unmoored me in a way. My mum was born in Taiwan, and her family came from China originally, and my dad's Welsh, and I was born in Canada. So I grew up just with a lot of languages and migrations in my family history. And the big thing for me was that, my first language was Mandarin, and I lost it as a child. I spoke it quite a lot when I was small, and then by the time I was maybe six or so, I quit going to Chinese school. I didn't like it. We stopped speaking Mandarin at home, and in a way, it's something I've never fully gotten back. I didn't really think a lot about that until I got to the point where I realized my German was better than my Mandarin. And that was one of those moments for me that was, I don't know, it was like upsetting in a way, which seems silly. I should have been happy that my German was so good, but it felt like a violation of my family's connection and, as if I had treated something that should have been treated with care, sort of flippantly. And so it made me really feel, I think I could feel a sense of home and connection when it came back to language, and I still find it when I speak Mandarin. It's like I speak like baby Mandarin, like a toddler. but it still feels to me like the most intimate thing. It feels to me like the language of motherly care from my childhood. A lot of that tied up with, when you move around a lot, obviously there are a lot of places that become home, but I think it's not just in the physical places that we have that sensation, right? So much of it in how we speak and how we communicate. And, sometimes for me, it could be as simple as listening to a song in Chinese that really can bring me back to that feeling.
Yeah, and just when you're saying that, I'm just thinking memories as well. Memories of objects that we associate with a person that was in that certain place. And if we're thinking about your second, do you call them novels or creative
No, they're
nonfiction?
memoirs. I would say they're
Yeah,
memoirs of
yeah.
nature, right? Yeah, nature memoirs.
I'm not putting any labels on it or any trying to put you in any boxes, right? But two trees make a forest. Just that title reminded me of Iceland. Like the history of Iceland was that they did have trees, but they were all cut down to build or to use as firewood. So there is that saying is like, when there is, if you find a couple of trees, oh, it's a forest sort of thing. So it really reminded me of that. But then also when you're talking about within that memoir, nature writing, the idea of islands, Iceland, island, how you are studying islands and how, I don't know, the fascination that we do have with islands because we're living on an island. But what is that thing, do you think, about islands? You've been to Taiwan, haven't you?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Taiwan for writing Two Trees and obviously just with my mum. I think for me, I find islands really fascinating because, how do I put it? I didn't grow up on one. I grew up like in the middle of Canada, not in the middle, but in the eastern part of Canada, fairly landlocked. We had the Great Lakes nearby, but it wasn't like I didn't grow up on an island. And I think for me, they just sort of fascinate me in terms of what they can mean for the biological sciences. Taiwan in particular has a really high rate of biodiversity, and there are a lot of endemic species. And I find little things like that quite interesting. But I think also because we have such potent imaginations for what islands mean. There's so many significant islands in myth, in history, in literature. Um, and when we speak about islands today, particularly island nations, I think it's really hard sometimes to separate those things away from how we think about them. And Taiwan obviously is a very contested nation. And for me, I think questioning that idea of an island and what an island affords, and obviously Taiwan is actually made up not just of one island, but of many, being able to really sort of interrogate that question and to think about like how islands do connect to mainlands and to continents and to other land masses. But yeah, for me, there was also this issue. It goes back to language again, and I opened the book with this sort of question. It's how we think about like what an island means. I think, in English and in most European languages, we think of islands in relation to water, which is obviously really resonant for me. But, in Chinese, the character that we use to write the word for island is actually a bird sitting on a mountain. That for me, I think was really, profound because Taiwan as an island is incredibly mountainous, rich with bird life, but also speaks to, I think, a different kind of framing that, how do I put it, height and this sort of geological escalation of mountains is perhaps more significant to speak about there than the water. But yeah, I don't know, it was just one of those things that I found curious, and I liked that gap. I liked thinking that we might approach them differently. So yeah, it was really helpful for me to think about.
There's something also in there, the idea of how places draw us in, but then also can push us back. Thinking about the natural world, how do you feel that has drawn you in? And was that there within your childhood or not? I mean, as you said, Central Canada, was that part of your upbringing, the natural world?
I mean, the natural world was, I think, intellectually was definitely a part of my childhood and my upbringing. When I was little, I really wanted to be a marine biologist. As it turns out, I'm really rubbish at science. Um, but I'm good at the sort of more humanities-based thinking around science, which is
Yeah.
why I do what I do now. Um, I was quite timid and afraid, I think, of what we might term wilderness or the natural world now. Like when I was a kid, we used to go on family hikes or camping trips or whatever, but I wasn't a kid that liked to sort of get muddy. I didn't like to go on rugged adventures. And I don't think it's because, how do I put it? It's not, I don't think it's because I didn't want to. I just think I had a lot of fear. And in adulthood, it's been really an exercise for me in sort of working with that fear and saying, I want to be a person that goes on really fun adventures. I really want to climb that mountain. I really want to, camp out and stay here by myself under the stars. And to say, actually, I might be terrified and I might think I can't do that, but actually I can. Um, so I don't know. I think I spent, my childhood going in one direction and my adulthood has been like, I guess compensating for that in some way, which is why now I really, I like to go climb up mountains and write about it. I like to, jump into frozen lakes and write about it and, have sort of figured out a way to make that my job. Um, but it's not something I think I could have imagined when I was a kid. Like I could have dreamed it because I would have loved to, but I was too afraid. Um, if you had told me that I would get over that fear or not get over it, but, learn to work through that fear, I might not have believed you.
Yeah. The natural world wasn't part of my upbringing.
Yeah, I think
Um,
for a lot of people of color, this is often the case. Um,
yeah.
and there is that sort of sense of like, I don't know, I have a lot of friends who also come from, their families come from migration backgrounds, and one of the things we often talk about, it's like, I didn't, come to this country and get this house so that we could go sleep in a tent.
Yes.
And I don't know, it was funny because we used to go camping as a kid, and my mom, she hated camping. My mom hates being dirty. She likes to shower in the morning and at night. She really likes being very clean, likes to sleep on clean sheets. And I think camping was her worst nightmare. And we used to joke that we used to call her a Gucci camper because she was just really like, she'd bring her fancy clothes and we'd be like, what are you going to do with that? She'd bring perfume and then she'd be like, well, mosquitoes biting me. And it was just really, it was one of those things where I was like, I did not come from the Patagonia wearing outdoor family, like that was not how I grew up at all.
Yeah.
Um, and that was, I think, important for me to say, like, that doesn't mean that I can't also find ways to experience the natural world. There's not a one size fits all approach to what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah, and that is so well said, and totally needed for me as a reminder to keep taking that on board, because there is as I say, every time that I try and push out of my comfort zone and say, hey, let's go here and try this area. There is that fear that comes up, and that idea of like what we're going to find there, how we're going to be received, that sort of thing. So
Mhm.
thank you for that reminder. Just a couple of more things, but we've been talking about your writing, but then within the your second memoir, there's a letter from your grandfather, a very long letter that you couldn't read, but you had it translated, and an image that stays with me is the idea of the thin paper with the text on it, with the light coming through the paper. And that reminded me of, you said maybe a landscape, a vertical landscape. And that idea of, how do you say, is it palmless step or the palmless?
Pacifist landscape.
And how, in a sense, that we're made up of all these different layers as human beings, these different layers that we take on board, but then also that are passed down to us. So this book is around your ancestry, and Taiwan, and but the forest and the natural world, and what we said about this migration culture. Your grandfather's time, they were a rural population. They did have that natural connection with nature, and that has been lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think for my grandfather, it was interesting because he grew up in the countryside, um, and then ended up moving. There was a lot of sort of turbulence through his childhood in China and through the 20s in particular. And so they moved into Beijing. They lived in the city, and he sort of moved around back and forth. And so I think he had this really early connection with land, and with landscape. The biggest thing I know in my grandparents' story is the idea that they were cut off, that their ties were severed to not only their actual families, the people, but to the places that they came from. They never got to return after the Civil War. And so they sort of spent their lives living elsewhere. And one of the things that I think is a great inheritance that, sort of survived nonetheless, particularly from my grandfather, is this attentiveness to plants. So, he might not have been able to go back to where he came from, but he had a good knowledge of plants and of gardening, and he passed that on to my mom. He was always an avid gardener, and through my mom, I've also picked up a lot. And that for me feels like, I guess, a kind of lineage. We may not be able to be rooted in a particular landscape, which I think perhaps because of this perspective that I have, I tend to view the idea of being able to say my ancestors were on this land and my ancestors before me and this is our land. That seems like a very privileged kind of statement to me. Um, and I know obviously that, that has its complications, particularly for communities that, might not be thriving right now, but where people have lived for generations. But for me, there is that, I feel that loss of connection to place in my family's history very acutely. But I really, really value the things that were passed down, and that is knowledge, that is affection, that is the art of noticing, I think, the natural world.
I think that has been missing within my life, until the last few years, where I have been really paying attention and becoming more aware.
And
Um,
cultivating that.
yeah, doing it not because I want something back, but because I felt that something was missing, maybe, or yeah. Because I don't want to do that idea that the relationship with nature that I have is one that is possessive, or it's one that take in that
Yeah.
sense. I do hope there's some mutual exchange going on there. The observation has definitely come along when I've been trying to do marrying my identity, my black identity, with my writing and nature.
Hmm.
Um, and so we've just been talking about your grandfather's letter, but you have also created with a team of editors Willow Herb Review,
Yeah.
and this isn't like a couple of years in
Yeah, it's
existence.
pretty young, since
Yeah.
2018.
Why did you create Willow Herb Review?
Yeah, so I founded the Willow Herb in 2018, basically out of frustration, if I'm honest. As a nature writer, I think I had been privy to and had just witnessed a lot of hand-wringing for a number of years about the state of diversity in nature writing. People were saying, oh, there are, it's all, white men traipsing through the countryside. We're not hearing from writers of color. We're not hearing from disabled people. We're not hearing from the working class. Um, and there was a lot of like, I just kept seeing newspaper editorials and pieces like that coming out being like, oh, there's a huge problem with the genre. It has a diversity problem. But no one at any stage would say, hey, actually, let's acknowledge the writers that are doing this work. Let's actually create spaces, So there were a lot of critical pieces coming out, but no opportunities given to actually rectify that. So I started the journal sort of out of frustration at that situation and said, you know what, I'm really tired of the think pieces. I'm really tired of people saying, oh, we have a diversity problem. I would really just prefer it if we gave space to it and put money in the hands of the writers who could change that. So for me, it was a very straightforward, like, we'll create a platform, we'll, generate some funds, and we'll pay those writers to do nature writing. And, it gives new writers who perhaps haven't tried the genre before an opportunity to try it, sort of without huge stakes. But also created a platform where we could showcase writers who have been doing this for a long time and say, this isn't new. We don't need to talk about writers of color as a new thing. We can acknowledge that this is something that has been under acknowledged, under platformed,
Yeah.
under read. So yeah, it was sort of I just got a bit sick and tired, to be honest.
Yeah, no,
Um,
because I think what you've said is so true. Underread, and almost, I don't know, because of the way things have been set up within publishing, they have been hidden. So I came to Black nature writing through the USA, getting frustrated for looking from a British perspective. And I'm so pleased that Willow Herb exists, because it makes it easier for me to get to
To
read.
find these
Yeah,
writers.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because there is that need and want to be amongst other people that are writing similar things, and to think
Yeah.
that you're
And
not.
this is what I struggled with at first because it's like I'm half Taiwanese, half white British, yes. But I would go to festivals and sit on panels and, be with other nature writers. And it was like I was like the most, in air quotes, like most diverse person they could trot out. And I was like, really? Because that's really not doing a very good job. As much as I would
Yeah,
love, the opportunity to talk about and promote my work, I also think like, I'm sorry, but I can just barely fill that diversity quota for someone. And
yeah,
so for me, it was also just, it was about creating a space where I could say, you know what, like we don't need to get into necessarily the arguments or even the politics of it. We can just do the work of giving these opportunities to writers and bringing these writers to readers so that readers can no longer say, oh, I can't find any writers of color. Like
yeah,
we have a whole bank of them we've published.
yeah.
There are loads.
And the thing is also that I find is how it usually works is that now that you've got Willow Hood review online, and then you get approached maybe from an established organization or council and say, hey, we want to work with you. I mean, and that happened with it was with Epping Forest.
Yeah, so it was with the Waltham Forest Borough of Culture project last year, and so they had us do a special issue related to Epping Forest and in response to the forest. And that was curated by Luke Turner and Kirstine McNish, who are based there in Walthamstow. And that was really cool because it was the first big collaboration we'd had as a journal. And it is essentially for us, it really is this channel for opportunities for new writers or for illustrators in that case as well, to be able to say, we've got this funding and we really actually want to pay you to do this work,
Yeah,
to professionalize it. Like
yeah,
I think a lot of writers don't get a fair rate for their work, are not treated as professionals, and we really, would like to change that. So,
yeah, yes.
I don't know, it's a very straightforward writer-friendly model that we've got.
Yeah, applaud it, and
Thank you.
because it stands out because there's so few of these around. To applaud you. We are coming to the end here, but I want to ask you about, what are your plans? I say this, what are your plans when who knows what's going to be happening next week or whatever? How are you continuing to develop your relationship with nature and writing about it?
So I think right now, I mean, I should say, plan-wise, literally my plan for the immediate future is that I'm actually finishing the next issue of the Willow Herb right now. It's going to be out end of August. I'm putting finishing touches on that right now, literally just doing the web formatting. So it doesn't feel particularly connected to nature. It feels like I'm very connected to the internet. Um, Aside from that, I mean, I'm really excited. We're actually moving. We're leaving Berlin in a few weeks at the end of September. I'm moving back to the UK for a new
Mm.
job, and I'm really excited to reconnect with place and get to know a new area. I'm moving actually also to Waltham Forest. I'll be moving right near Hackney Marshes in the Walthamstow wetlands. And it's not an area I know very well. So I'm actually really excited to connect to that and to get to know it, to find new swimming spots,
Yeah.
and yeah, just to try something a bit different. I think I could try to, I could be very scared about that, but I'm choosing instead to be excited. Yeah, that's what's on the horizon, I think, for us. But we'll see how it goes. Obviously, everything is pandemic permitting at the moment.
It is. It is. And it's finding that balance between making plans and not making plans, going with the flow. But that sounds exciting, to be moving into a new place and new haunts to explore.
Yeah, it's a bit bittersweet, but yeah, it's the right time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we wish you luck with
You.
that move and exploration. And again, I'd just like to thank you,
Thanks
Jessica,
for
for
having me.
being on and having this conversation. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.